Welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories.
The morning sun caught the waters of the swimming pool at Ravensholm Manor with a peculiar brilliance, transforming its crystalline surface into a sheet of hammered silver. Hercule Poirot, perched upon an ornate wrought-iron chair beneath a striped awning, observed this phenomenon with the quiet satisfaction of a man who found pleasure in small, orderly things. His morning tisane prepared, according to exacting specifications, by the hotel's head. Chef rested upon a small marble table at his elbow, steam rising in delicate spirals. "Magnificent," he murmured to himself, his precise accent lending the single word an almost musical quality, the geometry of water, the precision of light. All is harmony. Captain James Hastings, draped across a nearby lounger in white summer linen, smiled at his old friend's contentment. "You're in one of your philosophical moods," Poirot Hastings observed, adjusting his Panama hat against the glare. "Most men would simply say, 'It's a splendid day.' But I am not most men," Poirot replied with the faintest smile. "And yes, Hastings, it is indeed a splendid day, though perhaps too perfect. The little gray cells, they suggest that perfection is often merely the prelude to chaos. Nature abhors such immaculate order." They had arrived at Ravensholm Manor 3 days prior, guests of Lord and Lady Ashford for what promised to be an unremarkable weekend. The house itself, a sprawling Edwardian structure of pale honey-colored stone, dominated a bend in the Wye Valley, surrounded by grounds of studied elegance. The swimming pool, added some 5 years prior by the late Lord Ashford's experimental phase, as Lady Ashford had rather dismissively termed it, remained the mansion's most modern and incongruous feature. Hastings had accompanied Poirot at the invitation of their old friend, Colonel Whitmore, who served as Lord Ashford's oldest companion. The colonel, now in his 70th year, had suggested that the Belgian detective might appreciate a genuine English country weekend. No murders, no mysteries, merely the civilized pleasures of good company, fine food, and the English summer at its best. Poirot, who had found himself unexpectedly fatigued by a particularly complex matter involving diplomatic correspondence and the Vienna police, had accepted with unusual alacrity. The house party itself numbered 12 souls. Beyond Poirot and Hastings, there was Lord Ashford, a man of 60-odd years, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. His wife, the former Miss Catherine Delorme, was a woman of perhaps 45, possessed of striking dark beauty and an air of controlled melancholy. Their marriage, Hastings had mentioned quietly on the first evening, was known in society to be cordial but distant. Then there were the younger members of the party. The Ashford's son, Adrian, a man of 32 with his mother's dark looks and his father's commanding presence, had arrived on Friday afternoon with his wife. The vivacious Margarita, former actress, whose theatrical mannerisms had not diminished with marriage. Between them existed a tension of the sort that suggested either passionate devotion or mutual contempt, and quite possibly both. Lord Ashford's sister, Miss Violet Ashford, remained unmarried at 50. A sharp-tongued woman with an eye for detail and a tendency toward acid commentary on her brother's household management. She had views on everything, from the impropriety of Margaret's jewelry to the adequacy of the wine cellar. The remaining guests comprised a more varied assortment. There was Miss Eleanor Weatherby, a woman of some 30 years, employed by Lord Ashford as his secretary, a position that had caused some raised eyebrows in county society. Though Eleanor herself bore such scrutiny with quiet dignity, she was competent, intelligent, and possessed of an intriguing reticence about her personal history. Mr. Stephen Vane, a merchant banker of perhaps 45, had been Lord Ashford's friend and business associate for some 20 years. He was a man of precise speech and seemingly unlimited wealth, though Hastings had mentioned that there were whispers in certain circles about recent difficulties in his ventures. Then came the additions to the party, 3 younger guests whose presence had seemed to elevate the social temperature of the house perceptibly. Colonel Whitmore had explained them as connections of various sorts. The first was Miss Judith Hammond, a young woman of perhaps 28, dark-haired and intelligent, who was apparently a distant cousin of Lady Ashford's by marriage. She had a thoughtful manner and seemed to observe rather more than she participated. The second was Mr. Richard Thornton, a man of 34 with the superficial charm of someone practiced in the art of social enchantment. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and possessed of that particular quality of attentiveness that made each person he spoke to feel momentarily the center of the universe. He claimed connections in the colonial service, though the nature of those connections remained vague. The third was Mrs. Constance Mereditha, widow, she claimed, of some 3 years, who appeared to be perhaps 50, though she maintained the cultivated appearance of a woman considerably younger. She had been introduced as an old friend of the family, though Hastings noted that neither Lord nor Lady Ashford seemed entirely at ease with her presence. It was this assemblage that composed the house party at Ravensholm Manor as the weekend progressed, with all the comfortable predictability of a well-rehearsed dance. On Saturday evening, the party assembled for dinner, 12 people, seated around an enormous mahogany table, the silver catching candlelight, the wine flowing with practiced generosity. Poirot, as was his custom, observed rather more than he participated. He had positioned himself through no accident between Miss Weatherby and Mrs. Meredith, and from this vantage point he was able to monitor the currents and eddies of the assembled company with considerable precision. Lord Ashford presided at the head of the table with courteous attention to his guests, though Poirot noted a certain tension about his eyes, the bearing of a man preoccupied by matters not present in the immediate room. His wife, seated opposite, maintained the graceful demeanor expected of a hostess, yet there was something rehearsed in her smiles, as though she performed a role she had long ago memorized, but no longer inhabited with genuine feeling. Adrian and Margaret presented a study in contrasts. Adrian spoke little, responding to conversational offerings with monosyllables and distracted courtesy. Margaret, by contrast, dominated her section of the table with animated stories and theatrical gestures, tales of her acting days, witty observations about county society, and barbed remarks delivered with such charming precision that their sting was felt only in retrospect. "But my dear Lord Ashford," Margaret was saying, her eyes alight with mischief, "surely you cannot expect society to remain unchanged. Change is the very essence of vitality. Those who resist it become rather like museum pieces, do they not?" Miss Violet Ashford, thus obliquely referenced, stiffened perceptibly. "Change," she replied, with glacial courtesy, "is not always improvement. One might as readily say that those who embrace every fashionable alteration without discrimination become rather like weather vanes pointing in whichever direction the wind currently blows." Margaret laughed a sound like breaking glass. "Beautiful and dangerous. How droll, Miss Ashford, though I confess I had always rather admired weather vanes for their pragmatism." Poirot, observing this exchange, noted a quality in Margaret's laughter that suggested she enjoyed the contest as much for the conflict itself as for any point she might score. Here, he reflected, was a woman of considerable psychological complexity, one who required opposition as others required sustenance. Stephen Vane attempted to steer the conversation toward safer waters, discussing recent developments in the city, but his intervention lacked conviction. Poirot observed, that he drank rather more wine than the conversational content seemed to warrant, and that his eyes, when he thought himself unobserved, carried a quality of anxiety that his mannered speech did not reflect. Richard Thornton proved to be one of those individuals possessed of that peculiar social facility that allowed him to move fluidly between conversational groups. He directed charm impartially at Miss Weatherby, Mrs. Meredith, and even at the rather formidable Miss Ashford, each receiving the impression that they alone held his genuine interest. It was Poirot, reflected, an exhausting performance, one that spoke of considerable practice and, he suspected, considerable emptiness beneath. Miss Weatherby, seated next to Poirot, spoke little but observed much. When she did contribute to conversation, her remarks revealed a sharp intelligence and an appreciation for precision of language that Poirot found refreshing. "You find yourself amused by the proceedings, Miss Weatherby?" he inquired quietly, during a momentary lull in the general conversation. She glanced at him, a slight smile playing at her lips. "I find human nature endlessly instructive, Monsieur Poirot. This particular assembly is scarcely different from any other. The same desires, the same anxieties, the same carefully constructed facades, though perhaps the facades are a shade more obvious than in some contexts." "You are a student of human nature, I perceive," Poirot said. "I am a secretary, Monsieur Poirot. One learns observation by necessity. But observation raised to the level of art, I think. Lord Ashford is fortunate in his choice of employee." She did not respond directly to this, but her eyes flickered with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been wariness. It was Mrs. Meredith, on Poirot's other side, who proved the most forthcoming. She leaned toward him with the intimate manner of one sharing confidences. "Tell me, Monsieur Poirot, do you find Ravensholm as charming as I do? Such a distinguished house, though I confess I find the atmosphere this weekend somewhat charged. Do you sense it? There is a tension beneath the civility." Poirot sipped his wine with deliberation. "There is always tension, madame, beneath the surface of civilized society. It is, perhaps, the price we pay for civilization itself. The question is merely one of degree. But surely you, with your reputation, can sense when that tension is approaching some critical point." Poirot regarded her with renewed interest. "My reputation, madame, is based upon the study of facts, rather than the reading of atmospheres. The facts, they are observable and verifiable. The atmosphere," he gestured delicately, "it is subject to interpretation." Yet, even as he spoke, he found himself listening with greater attention to the currents beneath the dinner-table conversation. There was, indeed, a quality of anticipation in the room, not quite tension, but something approaching it. The carefully maintained social performance seemed to rest upon some foundation that was not quite stable. It was Miss Judith Hammond, speaking from the far end of the table, who brought matters into slightly sharper focus. "I understand there is a tennis tournament planned for tomorrow," she observed, "on the courts near the house. I confess I have not played in several years." "We have rather made it a competition," Adrian replied, with more animation than he had previously displayed. "Singles in the morning, and pairs in the afternoon. Father has offered a small prize, the latest novel by Miss Sayers, I believe." "How very civilized," Richard Thornton remarked. "Though I must warn you all, I was rather known for my tennis at university. I should hate to monopolize the championship." Margaret, predictably, could not resist the opening. "Oh, Richard, surely one must be known for something beyond one's proficiency at games. Though I suppose in the colonial service they value athletic prowess above intellectual accomplishment." "On the contrary," Richard replied with undisturbed cheerfulness, "they value results above all else. Athletic prowess, I find, is merely another form of achieving them." The exchange was light, yet beneath it ran a current of genuine dislike. Poirot's antennae, as he might have phrased it, vibrated with perception. There was history between these two, or, at the very least, a mutual assessment that had found each wanting in the other's estimation. After dinner, the party separated into factions. The gentlemen lingered over port and cigars, while the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, that last bastion of Victorian propriety that Lord Ashford had been reluctant to abandon, despite his wife's modernizing impulses. It was in the drawing room, some hour after dinner, that Poirot elected to make an appearance. He preferred, he had explained to Hastings earlier, to observe the natural patterns of social interaction without the constrained formality of segregated spaces. He found the ladies arranged with studied casualness around the fireplace. Lady Ashford was embroidering with meticulous concentration. Miss Ashford was reading the newspaper with an air of disapproval. Miss Weatherby sat somewhat apart, a book open before her, but her attention seemingly drawn to the middle distance. Miss Hammond played softly at the piano. Chopin, Poirot noted, and competently performed. Mrs. Meredith held court from an armchair, while Margaret sprawled across a sofa with the abandonment of the theatrically trained, her dress arranged to advantage. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Margaret exclaimed upon his entrance. "You have abandoned the gentleman already? How wise." Their conversation had deteriorated into an incomprehensible discussion of stock prices and agricultural yields. I found it rather tedious myself. "You were present at such a discussion, madame?" Poirot inquired with gentle surprise. "Only briefly. Adrian found he required my opinion on a matter, and I followed him into the dining room for a moment. I'm afraid I found the financial minutiae rather beyond my interest. I returned here, where civilized conversation might be had." Poirot seated himself with careful precision in a chair positioned to observe the assembly. "Tell me," he addressed the room generally, "how long has this house party been planned? It seems to me a gathering of considerable complexity to organize." "Oh, it has been in the works for some weeks," Lady Ashford replied, setting down her embroidery. "My husband enjoys bringing people together. He finds it stimulating, I believe, though people is perhaps not quite the precise term," Miss Ashford observed acerbically, not lowering her newspaper. "It would be more accurate to say he enjoys bringing together a collection of individuals with no clear commonality beyond his own presumed interest in entertaining them." "My dear sister," Lady Ashford said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "you are, as always, unsparing in your observations." "Someone must be," Miss Ashford replied. "Truth is rarely found in the comfortable platitudes that others prefer." It was Mrs. Meredith who intervened, redirecting the conversation with practiced ease. "But surely the true pleasure of a gathering such as this lies in the unexpected connections that form. One never knows quite what one will discover about one's companions until one finds oneself in these intimate circumstances." "Discoveries," Poirot said softly, "can be either welcome or unwelcome, madame. It depends entirely upon what one has hidden from the light." There was a moment of silence following this observation, brief, but perceptible. It was broken by the entrance of the gentleman, led by Lord Ashford, who announced that a game of cards would be established for those interested in such entertainment. The remainder of the evening passed in that particular pattern of English country house weekends: conversation, the careful maintenance of social convention, and beneath it all, that subtle current of disquiet that seemed to run like an underground stream through the gathering. Sunday morning dawned clear and beautiful. The tennis tournament proceeded as planned, with Mr. Thornton demonstrating the proficiency he had claimed, and Miss Hammond revealing unexpected talent. Adrian played with mechanical efficiency, but little enthusiasm, while Margaret declared herself fatigued and preferred to observe from beneath a shaded parasol, her commentary a mixture of encouragement and subtle mockery. It was during the luncheon that followed the morning matches that Poirot became aware of something amiss. The party had assembled beneath an enormous marquee erected on the lawn, where the household staff had laid out a cold collation of considerable appeal. It was Miss Weatherby who first brought the matter to his attention. approaching him as he stood contemplating the wine selection with his habitual deliberation. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "I wonder if you have noticed anything unusual regarding Mrs. Meredith." Poirot turned to regard her with interest. "Unusual in what manner, Miss Weatherby?" "She was not present at breakfast this morning, and when I encountered her some moments ago, she appeared considerably agitated. Her dress was disarranged, and there was a quantity of dust upon her sleeve, as though she had been." Eleanor paused, searching for the appropriate phrase, disturbed, or had encountered some physical disturbance. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. It was precisely the sort of detail that most observers would have overlooked entirely. "You perceive much, Miss Weatherby. Show me this phenomenon, if you will." They made their way, with careful casualness, toward the refreshment table, where Mrs. Meredith was selecting items for her plate. Now that his attention was drawn to it, Poirot could indeed perceive the dystery that Eleanor had described. The woman's morning dress appeared to have been hastily adjusted, and there was, as Eleanor had noted, a distinct quantity of soil upon the upper portion of her sleeve. Moreover, and this was the detail that most engaged Poirot's attention, there was a small yet visible scratch upon her right cheek, partially obscured by cosmetics, but evident to one who possessed his particular observational abilities. "Mrs. Meredith," he addressed her with courteous concern, "I perceive that you have met with some small accident this morning. The unfortunate mark upon your face suggests some impact." Mrs. Meredith's hand flew instinctively to her cheek. "It is nothing, Monsieur. A trifling matter. I rose early and took a walk through the garden. In my abstraction, I neglected to observe the low branch of a rose bush. The rose is a beautiful flower, but it possesses a thorny temperament, does it not?" The explanation was plausible, yet something in her manner suggested it was not the entire truth. Her eyes flickered away from his, and there was a quality of rehearsed distress in her voice that suggested preparation rather than spontaneous account-giving. "The rosebush," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Yet I perceive that the scratch is upon your right cheek, whereas the rosebush through which you presumably walked would approach from the direction where the left side of your face would encounter it first. The geometry, I am afraid, does not support your explanation entirely." Eleanor, standing quietly nearby, made a small sound, not quite a gasp, but something approaching it. Mrs. Meredith's composure wavered for only a moment. "You are as observant as your reputation suggests, Monsieur Poirot. Very well. I confess that this morning I encountered Mr. Thornton in the garden, and we had a small disagreement. In the course of our discussion, I was somewhat roughly handled. It was nothing of consequence, merely the sort of thing that occurs between old acquaintances who have experienced tensions in the past." This revelation produced several significant effects. Miss Weatherby's eyes widened. Richard Thornton, some distance away, suddenly became intensely absorbed in the examination of a ham sandwich, and from the far side of the marquee, Adrian Ashford's head turned sharply in their direction, his expression hardening perceptibly. "I see," Poirot said, with apparent neutrality, though his eyes had taken on that particular brightness that indicated active mental engagement. "And the dust upon your sleeve. This also was the result of this disagreement." "I fell," Mrs. Meredith said shortly. "The matter is ended, Monsieur I would prefer not to discuss it further, if you will forgive me." She turned away, bearing her plate toward a seat at some distance from the company. It was later, as Poirot and Hastings withdrew for their customary afternoon rest, that the former addressed the matter with his old friend. "Something is not quite right," Hastings, Poirot observed, as they made their way toward the library where they typically retreated during the afternoon hours. "Beneath the surface of this apparently civilized gathering, there exist tensions of considerable magnitude." "I say, Poirot," Hastings replied with concern, "you're not suggesting that we've stumbled into some sort of dangerous situation? Because if you are, I confess I should prefer to leave before matters progress further. No, Poirot assured him. It is merely that the little gray cells perceive a pattern emerging. There are tensions between individuals, between Mrs. Meredith and Mr. Thornton, clearly. Between Adrian and Margaret, certainly. Between Stephen Vane and I am not yet certain with whom. These tensions, they are the normal stuff of human interaction. Yet, there is something else, some quality of anticipation, as though events were approaching some critical juncture. Perhaps it is merely a house party, Hastings suggested. Such gatherings often produce various emotional currents. Perhaps, Poirot agreed, and yet I find myself increasingly of the opinion that we should keep our observational faculties at their height during the remainder of our stay. The afternoon was passed quietly. Poirot occupied himself with a French novel of considerable intellectual demand, while Hastings dozed. But toward evening, as they prepared to descend for tea, Hastings mentioned a curious incident he had witnessed. "I was passing through the corridor toward our room some hour ago," he explained, "when I observed Adrian and his father in heated discussion in the study. The door was ajar, and I could not help but catch fragments of their conversation. Adrian appeared to be asking for money, considerable sums, I gathered, and his father was refusing. The language became rather heated, I'm afraid." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "So here, perhaps, is another tension. Financial difficulties, it would appear. And Adrian is the heir, is he not? The prospect of reduced circumstances might prove distressing to one whose entire life has been predicated upon assumed wealth." That evening's dinner was conducted with all the outward civility expected of the occasion, yet to Poirot's trained perception, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a quality of expectation in the air, not unpleasant, but definite. The conversation ran to lighter topics, seemingly by tacit agreement, and the party dispersed early, with most guests retiring by 11 o'clock. Poirot, however, found himself unable to achieve sleep. Long past midnight, he made his way to the library, selecting a volume at random from Lord Ashford's collection and settling himself in an armchair beside the dying fire. It was a work on Renaissance art, and he occupied himself with its illustrations, his mind continuing its peculiar nocturnal operations. It was perhaps 2 o'clock when he became aware of sounds from the hallway, footsteps, moving with evident purpose, descending toward the lower levels of the house. He rose and made his way to the library door, opening it sufficiently to observe the passage without himself being seen. Adrian Ashford was making his way toward the rear of the house, a small leather case in his hand. His expression was one of determination, tinged with anxiety. He was followed, at a discreet distance, by Eleanor Weatherby, who moved with careful quietness and whose presence suggested deliberate pursuit rather than coincidental encounter. Poirot's eyebrows rose. He found himself consumed with curiosity regarding the destination and purpose of these nocturnal movements. Yet his sense of propriety counseled restraint. To follow them would be to overstep the bounds of acceptable behavior, regardless of his suspicions. And suspicions, after all, were not facts. The little gray cells required evidence before drawing conclusions. He returned to his armchair and his book, though he found concentration now impossible. His mind churned with questions and incomplete patterns, much as a geometrical figure might be rearranged again and again in search of perfect symmetry. It was nearly an hour later when he heard the sounds of return footsteps ascending the staircase, moving with a quality of hastening that suggested urgency. Then silence. The night pressed on toward morning, and still, Poirot did not achieve sleep. Monday morning arrived with a peculiar quality of anticlimax. The sun rose on what promised to be another beautiful day. The household staff moved through their customary routines. The party assembled for breakfast with varying degrees of enthusiasm and wakefulness, yet there was an undercurrent of tension that had grown from implicit to nearly explicit. Margaret appeared pale and ate little. Adrian scarcely touched his food, instead pursuing a methodical destruction of the morning's newspaper, though his eyes followed the words without apparent comprehension. Stephen Vane drank 3 cups of coffee in succession, each gulped with evident desperation. It was Colonel Whitmore who suggested, shortly after 10 o'clock, that a swimming party might be established for those interested in taking advantage of the excellent weather and the still waters of the pool. "The morning light is magnificent," he observed, "and the water, I am told, is at a most pleasant temperature. Shall we assemble there around 11? The suggestion met with mixed responses. Miss Ashford declared her aversion to public bathing costumes. Lady Ashford pleaded headache and retired to her sitting room, but the younger members of the party, and several others, seemed to perceive it as a welcome diversion from the undercurrents pervading the house. Poirot and Hastings accepted with their usual courtesy, and made their way to their rooms to effect the necessary costume changes. It was perhaps 30 minutes later when the party began to assemble on the pool's margins. The massive rectangular expanse of water glittered in the sunlight, surrounded by white marble paving and bordered with substantial shrubs and flowering plants that provided privacy from the road. Beyond, Margaret appeared first, attired in a fashionable bathing costume of striking modernity, blue and white confection that revealed considerably more of her physique than conventional society might have deemed appropriate, yet which she wore with such unconscious confidence that any sense of impropriety was somehow negated. She dove into the water with theatrical grace and swam several rapid lengths before emerging and settling herself upon one of the loungers, her attention apparently devoted to a magazine, though her eyes followed each new arrival with evident interest. Richard Thornton appeared next, and then Judith Hammond, attired in a more modest but flattering costume. Adrian came last of the younger party members, his manner suggesting a preference for being elsewhere, yet compelled by social obligation to participate. Colonel Whitmore had arrived with a book and settled himself beneath the awning, declaring himself content to supervise rather than participate. Eleanor Weatherby occupied herself with arranging towels and refreshments with her characteristic quiet efficiency. Poirot, meanwhile, had positioned himself in a substantial rattan chair positioned at the pool's edge, declaring himself content with observation. He held a newspaper, though it served more as a prop than as a focus for genuine attention. "You will not swim, Monsieur Poirot," Margaret called from her lounger. "The water is quite delightful, I assure you." "Alas, Madame, the little Belgian has not the physique for such modern exhibitions," Poirot replied. "I am content to remain as I am. I have observed," Margaret said with a smile that suggested mischief, "that you are content to remain as you are in nearly all circumstances, Monsieur Poirot. It is either admirable consistency or profound rigidity. I have not yet determined which." "Perhaps," Madame Poirot replied mildly, "it is both." For the next quarter hour, the swimmers occupied themselves with swimming and leisurely conversation. Richard Thornton demonstrated considerable proficiency in the water, though Hastings noted that Adrian seemed deliberately to avoid swimming near him, and when their paths did occasionally cross, there were exchanges of civility, but no genuine interaction. It was Miss Hammond who first expressed a desire for greater activity. "I wonder," she suggested, "if there might be a diving board. A pool of this size surely possesses such an amenity." "The board was removed some months ago," Eleanor informed her, her tone suggesting she regretted the necessity. Lord Ashford felt it unsafe to maintain after several years of weather had taken their toll upon the structure. There have been discussions of replacement, but the matter has not yet been resolved. "Pity," Miss Hammond said. "I rather enjoyed diving. It was one of the few physical activities at which I achieved any genuine competence." The party continued, moving through the ritual motions of aquatic leisure. Hastings participated, swimming a careful series of lengths before emerging and settling himself on a lounger with a towel and a satisfied sigh. It was perhaps 20 minutes after 11, Poirot noted, the time with his habitual precision, when Margaret suddenly rose from her lounger and approached the pool's edge. "I believe," she announced, "that I shall endeavor a dive, despite the absence of a formal board. The pool's depth surely permits such an activity at this end." "I should not recommend it, madame," Eleanor said with quiet concern. "The depth is uncertain at the deep end. The bottom slopes irregularly." But Margaret had already divested herself of her robe and was poised upon the edge of the pool, her movements carrying that same theatrical quality that characterized all her actions. She bounced twice, as if to judge the optimal moment, and then launched herself forward with considerable grace and momentum. For perhaps 2 seconds, the dive appeared entirely successful. She entered the water with minimal disturbance, her body achieving that elegant trajectory that characterized successful diving. Then something changed. Perhaps it was the irregular bottom that Eleanor had mentioned. Perhaps it was some submerged object that had escaped notice. Poirot would later reflect extensively upon the precise mechanics of what occurred next. Margaret's scream, for it was undoubtedly a screamy from the water, as her body convulsed upward with sudden violence. She thrashed toward the pool's edge with considerable urgency, her swimming technique abandoned in favor of pure instinctive struggle. "Help!" she gasped, her voice carrying a note of genuine terror that transcended theatrical affectation. "Something there is something." Richard Thornton, who was nearest, immediately swam toward her, his expression shifting from casual enjoyment to focused concern. He reached her within seconds, grasping her arm and assisting her toward the edge of the pool. It was then that they saw the body that Margaret's thrashing had disturbed, from whatever resting place it had occupied beneath the surface. Mrs. Constance Meredith, attired in no bathing costume, but in the black dress she had worn at dinner the previous evening, floated face downward in the water, her hair streaming about her in the current, perfectly motionless. Time seemed to arrest itself. The world appeared to pause in its rotation, then dash chaos. Eleanor moved first, her training overcoming her shock, and called sharply for assistance. Colonel Whitmore stumbled to his feet, his book falling unheeded to the ground. Richard and Hastings worked together to extract the body from the water, while Judith Hammond covered her mouth with a hand and turned away, her composure visibly shattered. Poirot, rising from his chair with deliberate precision, observed every element of the scene with the intensity of a man recording details against future necessity. His eyes took in everything: the position of the body, the expressions of those present, the patterns of movement and reaction, the small details that most observers would overlook in the grip of immediate shock. Adrian stood frozen, his face having lost all color. Eleanor had begun CPR on Mrs. Meredith's motionless form with desperate urgency, though her eyes suggested that she harbored no genuine hope of success. Richard Thornton had moved to Margaret and wrapped her in a towel, holding her as she wept and shook with shock. It was Hastings who finally looked toward Poirot, his eyes asking the questions that the moment did not permit to be spoken. Poirot met his gaze for a moment, then looked back toward the pool, his expression unreadable. "The authorities must be summoned immediately," he said quietly to Eleanor, who nodded and moved toward the house at a hurried pace. "And I fear, Hastings, that our peaceful weekend has concluded rather abruptly." The world, which had seemed so ordered and civilized moments before, had shifted irrevocably into the realm of tragedy and complexity. The local police arrived within the hour. 2 constables and, shortly thereafter, Inspector David Frome, a man of perhaps 5 years, with the weathered appearance of one accustomed to the rural crime of the English countryside. He was competent rather than brilliant, methodical rather than inspired, which was to say that he represented precisely the type of investigator who was both blessed and cursed in his dealings with Hercule Poirot. Within moments of Inspector Frome's arrival, the body of Mrs. Meredith had been carefully removed to a secure location, pending examination by the medical examiner. The pool area had been cordoned off with a series of ropes and placards bearing the stern warning, "Police investigation, do not disturb." The household had been assembled in the drawing room, that same drawing room where, just the previous evening, the company had gathered for cards and conversation. The atmosphere had transmuted entirely. Where there had been civility, however strained, there now existed an almost palpable dread. It was Lord Ashford who broke the silence, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled distress. "This is absurd," he declared. "The woman appears to have drowned. Tragic, certainly, but it was undoubtedly an accident. There can be no question of anything more sinister." Inspector Frome, who had been consulting quietly with one of his constables, turned to regard Lord Ashford with the careful courtesy of a professional who has encountered such reactions many times before. "We shall need to establish the facts of the matter, Lord Ashford, before we can determine the precise nature of Mrs. Meredith's death. The medical examination will proceed, of course, but there are certain anomalies that warrant investigation." "Anomalies?" Lady Ashford asked, her voice scarcely above a whisper. "The body was fully clothed," the inspector replied with clinical precision. "One does not typically go swimming in a dinner gown and jewelry. Moreover, there are abrasions upon the deceased's wrists that are consistent with her having been forcibly restrained." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. "You are suggesting," Miss Ashford said, with sharp precision, "that the woman was murdered, that she did not simply slip and fall into the water." "I am suggesting nothing at this juncture, Miss Ashford. I am merely noting the facts as they present themselves. We shall require statements from each of you regarding your knowledge of Mrs. Meredith's movements on this morning, and indeed, throughout her stay." It was at this point that Inspector Frome became aware of Hercule Poirot's presence in the assemblage. One of his constables had whispered something into his ear, and his expression underwent a subtle but definite transformation, a mixture of relief and resignation that suggested he recognized both the blessing and the complexity of the situation. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, extending his hand with apparent welcome, "I confess, I was not aware that you were present at Ravens. This matter has just become considerably more significant, I fear." Poirot rose with his habitual courtesy and accepted the offered hand with a slight inclination of his head. "Inspector Frome," he replied, "we have not previously encountered one another, I believe, yet I find myself aware of your reputation. You are known to possess both intelligence and integrity qualities, not invariably found in conjunction. You are kind, Monsieur Poirot. I confess I am both pleased and somewhat apprehensive to have you present at this investigation. Your standards are exacting, I understand. The standards are merely those of truth and logic, Inspector. They are exacting only for those who attempt to substitute convenience for accuracy. For one committed to facts, they are merely the natural order of things." Inspector Frome nodded slowly. "Then perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, you would be willing to provide your own account of this morning's events. You were present at the pool, I understand." "I was indeed, Inspector, and I shall be delighted to offer such observations as I have made. But perhaps it would be most efficient if I were first to examine the immediate scene, the pool area, and this. I perceive that your constables have conducted a preliminary investigation, yet there may be details that reward closer examination." What followed was an hour of the most meticulous investigation, while Inspector Frome remained in the drawing room conducting preliminary interviews. Poirot occupied himself with a systematic examination of the pool area and its immediate surroundings. He studied the marble paving, noting the precise patterns of moisture and dry surface that suggested where bodies had moved and from what position. He examined the loungers and their arrangement, the refreshment table, the pathways leading to and from the pool complex. Every detail, no matter how minute, received his careful attention. Most significantly, he perceived something that had not yet been noted by the local investigators. At the pool's deep end, partially submerged among the aquatic plants and bottom debris, there lay a small leaden weight, the sort used for holding down canvas coverings or similar purposes, and tied to this weight, via a length of thin cord, was a leather purse. "Interesting," Poirot murmured, his fingers not quite touching the object, but hovering near it with evident fascination. "Most interesting indeed." When he finally returned to the drawing room, he found that Inspector Frome had already interviewed several of the household members. Adrian had been questioned regarding his knowledge of Mrs. Meredith's presence at the house, which, he stated, was minimal. Richard Thornton had been asked about the scratches on Mrs. Meredith's face, which had been noted by Eleanor, and were now a matter of investigation. "I can explain those," Richard had apparently stated. "Mrs. Meredith and I encountered one another in the garden yesterday morning. We had known each other some years ago, and our relationship was ... complicated. There was a disagreement that became physical, though it was brief, and concluded without lasting harm to either party. And yet this morning, Inspector Frome had noted, she was dead. Yes, Inspector, which renders my actions all the more difficult to contemplate. However, I assure you, I had nothing whatever to do with her death. After our encounter in the garden, I did not see Mrs. Meredith again until the moment she collapsed in the pool this morning." It was into this atmosphere of suspicion and preliminary investigation that Poirot now reinserted himself. Inspector Frome looked toward him with evident expectation. "I have discovered something that may prove instructive," Inspector Poirot began, and proceeded to explain the location of the leather purse. "The device suggests that the purse was deliberately weighted and concealed beneath the pool. One must inquire why this might be. The purse contained money, presumably?" Inspector Frome asked. "One must investigate such matters precisely," Poirot replied. "The purse has not yet been removed from the pool, pending proper procedure. But this raises the question, was Mrs. Meredith's death motivated by robbery? And if so, how does one reconcile the apparent attempt to hide the purse with the body being left in the pool, where it would almost certainly be discovered?" The inspector frowned, following the logic. "Unless," he said slowly, "the body was not intended to be discovered immediately. The weight would have kept the body submerged for some period, perhaps indefinitely, if the circumstances of discovery had been different." "Precisely, Inspector. The murderer anticipated, or hoped, that the body might remain undiscovered for an extended period. Yet it was discovered within hours, a most unfortunate development for the perpetrator. Then the drowning was deliberately arranged. The facts suggest that Mrs. Meredith was placed in the water while already deceased. Inspector, the medical examination will, I trust, provide confirmation. The abrasions upon her wrists suggest that she was restrained, perhaps held beneath the surface, or perhaps bound to facilitate transport. These are matters that the medical investigator can clarify with precision." Over the remainder of the day and into the evening, Poirot occupied himself with interviews. Each member of the household was questioned in turn, though Inspector Frome conducted the formal interrogations while Poirot observed from a position of apparent casualness, yet actual intense engagement. What emerged was a picture of considerable complexity. Mrs. Meredith, it transpired, had been known to several members of the party prior to this weekend, a fact that had been studiously concealed or minimized during initial discussions. Richard Thornton had acknowledged knowing her some years ago, as had Lord Ashford, who finally admitted, after careful questioning, that Mrs. Meredith had been the former wife of a business associate, and that the marriage had ended under circumstances involving some scandal. Stephen Vane, when pressed, admitted that he had encountered Mrs. Meredith previously in the context of financial negotiations, though he was deliberately vague regarding the nature of those transactions. Most intriguingly, Eleanor Weatherby, when questioned in private by Poirot, revealed that she had observed Mrs. Meredith, in recent conversation with Adrian, and that the conversation had appeared to involve considerable intensity and emotional weight. "What did you overhear of their discussion?" Poirot inquired gently. Eleanor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the breach of confidentiality that such revelation involved. "They spoke of matters of a financial nature," she finally said. "Adrian appeared to be seeking something from Mrs. Meredith, money, perhaps, or information regarding money. She seemed to be withholding her agreement, using her withholding as leverage for some other purpose." "And what purpose might that have been?" Poirot pressed. "I could not determine that with certainty, Monsieur Poirot, but she appeared to be attempting to negotiate some form of reconciliation or reconnection with Lord Ashford. At one point I heard her say, 'Your father and I have unfinished business. Perhaps this weekend will permit us to address it.' This revelation opened entirely new avenues of investigation. When Lord Ashford was subsequently questioned regarding the nature of his relationship with Mrs. Meredith, he initially continued to deny any connection beyond the most superficial acquaintance. Only when Poirot presented him with the observation that Eleanor had presented, notably, without identifying Eleanor as the source did, Lord Ashford's composure finally cracked. "Very well," he admitted, his face darkening. "Mrs. Meredith was not a mere acquaintance. Some 15 years ago, there was an involvement between us. It was a foolish episode in my youth. I was vulnerable following an illness, and she was, persuasive. It concluded when I recognized my responsibilities and my wife's claims upon my attention. And this weekend," Poirot prompted, "did Mrs. Meredith contact you before her arrival?" "She contacted my secretary, Miss Weatherby, and indicated her desire to be invited to this gathering. I confess I was surprised and not particularly pleased, but to refuse would have been to invite speculation. I believed it wiser to permit her attendance and hoped that she would conduct herself with appropriate discretion. Yet she appeared not to conduct herself with discretion," Poirot observed. "She had altercations with Mr. Thornton, conversations of apparent intensity with your son, and presumably various other interactions. She was, in fact, a rather disruptive presence at what was intended to be a peaceful weekend gathering." Lord Ashford did not immediately respond. His eyes moved toward the window, as though he hoped to find answers in the retreating light of evening. "She was a dangerous woman," he finally said quietly. "I had hoped that time and absence had diminished her capacity to cause complications. I was apparently mistaken. By the second day following Mrs. Meredith's death, the situation had evolved into something approaching crisis." The medical examination had confirmed Poirot's preliminary assessment. Mrs. Meredith had been murdered indeed. The evidence suggested she had been dead for nearly 12 hours before her body was discovered in the pool. Drowning, the medical examiner had concluded, was not the cause of death, but rather a method of concealment employed after her demise. The actual cause had been blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, consistent with a powerful blow delivered from behind. This revelation had the effect of transforming the psychological atmosphere of Ravensholm Manor from suspicion into something approaching panic. The household, which had previously moved through the corridors with comparative normalcy, now seemed characterized by barely suppressed anxiety. Conversations ceased abruptly when staff members appeared. Eyes avoided contact. The smooth functioning of household routines began to deteriorate as the servants grappled with the knowledge that a murderer walked among them. Inspector Frome, to his credit, pursued the investigation with methodical precision. The murder weapon never definitively identified, though a substantial paperweight from Lord Ashford's study bore traces of blood. Consistent with the injury had been discovered by Poirot in a shrub near the pool access path. The timing of Mrs. Meredith's death was established as occurring sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning, a window that encompassed the hours when most of the household was asleep. Yet, it was precisely this window of time that rendered the identification of the murderer impossibly complex, with the exception of nighttime staff, who occupied quarters in a separate section of the manor. There was no reliable method of establishing who had been awake, or who might have ventured to the pool in the pre-dawn hours. It was on the morning of the third day that Poirot requested a private meeting with Inspector Frome in the study. The two men settled themselves in that room, the same study from which Adrian had pleaded with his father for funds, the same room whose paperweight had apparently been employed in the commission of murder. "I have formed certain conclusions regarding this matter," Poirot began, "though the evidence is still incomplete. However, there are several elements that, when considered together, begin to suggest a pattern of considerable interest." Inspector Frome leaned forward with evident interest. "I am prepared to hear your reasoning, Monsieur Poirot. I confess that the facts as presented have resisted coherent interpretation. Every member of the household appears to possess some complication of connection to the deceased." "Precisely so, Inspector, and it is this very multiplicity of complications that suggests a systematic pattern rather than a crime of passion or simple opportunity. Someone, and I am not yet certain who, has deliberately created circumstances in which multiple members of this household party possessed strong motivation for Mrs. Meredith's death. This suggests either that the murderer is a master of manipulation, or that the murder was motivated by factors distinct from those that appeared to characterize the surface relationships." "Can you elaborate upon that notion?" Frome asked. "Consider, if you will, the chain of events. Mrs. Meredith arrives at this house party, an arrival that appears sudden, yet is revealed to have been the result of deliberate arrangement through Lord Ashford's secretary. Upon her arrival, she immediately manifests knowledge of various individuals, secrets, and vulnerabilities. She has been the former intimate of Lord Ashford. She has known Richard Thornton previously under circumstances that resulted in physical altercation. She has some connection to Adrian Ashford, a connection that, from available evidence, involves financial matters. She apparently has some relationship with Stephen Vane, though the exact nature remains obscured." "You are suggesting that Mrs. Meredith was employing her presence at the party as a means of manipulation?" Frome asked. "I am suggesting, Inspector, that Mrs. Meredith's purpose for attending this weekend was not social pleasure, but rather the advancement of certain specific objectives that almost certainly involved financial compensation or the resolution of past matters to her advantage. She was, in essence, a woman skilled in the art of leverage, and she was employing this weekend as an opportunity to exercise that skill against multiple parties simultaneously." The inspector processed this information with evident thoughtfulness. "If this is accurate, then we must determine not whether multiple parties possessed motive, for clearly they did, but rather which party possessed both motive and opportunity in sufficient measure to overcome ethical restraint." "Precisely, Inspector, and here is where the investigation becomes complex. For while multiple parties possessed motive, the opportunity, the ability to be at the pool in the pre-dawn hours without observation, to have been available to almost every member of the household, yet there must be some element that distinguishes the guilty party from the innocent," Frome suggested. "There must indeed," Poirot agreed, "and that element is what the little gray cells have been endeavoring to isolate. I believe, Inspector, that you and I must now conduct a series of interviews of somewhat greater specificity than those previously undertaken. There are certain facts that must be established with precision. Over the next several hours, Poirot and Inspector Frome conducted what might be termed a second round of interrogations, though they were marked by considerably greater incisiveness than the initial interviews had displayed. It was during the questioning of Adrian Ashford that several key revelations emerged. Adrian, when pressed regarding his financial situation, finally admitted that his circumstances were considerably more precarious than his position as the heir to an English earldom might suggest. "My father," Adrian explained with evident reluctance, "has experienced significant losses in recent years. Agricultural income has declined. Investments have faltered. He is not in the position to maintain Ravensholm at its current level indefinitely. The estate will eventually pass to me. My mother has settled certain funds, but as matters now stand, the inheritance may consist largely of debt, and Mrs. Meredith, Poirot prompted. What was her connection to your financial difficulties? Adrian's face darkened. She implied that she possessed knowledge of certain matters that, if revealed, would complicate my father's financial position further. She suggested that in exchange for a substantial payment, some £15,000, she would maintain her silence. Blackmail. In essence, Inspector Frome observed with grim precision. Yes, blackmail, though I did not discover the precise subject of her extortion until recently. And what was that subject? Poirot asked, with quiet insistence. Adrian struggled visibly with the admission. Mrs. Meredith claimed to possess evidence that my father was involved in certain business dealings of questionable legality some 15 years ago during the period of their intimate involvement, I presume. Nothing provable, she suggested, but sufficiently compromising to cause significant embarrassment if revealed in the current political climate. The implications of this revelation were immediate and profound. If Lord Ashford's reputation were damaged by such revelations, his social position and his business standing would be severely compromised. The family's financial situation, already precarious, might become genuinely catastrophic. Did you tell your father of Mrs. Meredith's demands? Inspector Frome asked. No, I did not. I attempted to negotiate with her myself, hoping to minimize her demands or to persuade her to release the supposed evidence. I was unsuccessful. When Lord Ashford himself was subsequently questioned regarding this matter, he corroborated Adrian's account and provided additional details. The business dealings to which she referred, he explained, involved certain transactions regarding land acquisition and development in the colonies. The legal situation regarding such transactions was, at the time, ambiguous. While I believed and still believe my actions to have been entirely proper, certain interests might have viewed them differently. Mrs. Meredith possessed knowledge of these transactions through her former husband, who was involved in certain regulatory capacities. She threatened to provide this information to certain parties if not compensated. A substantial sum, Poirot inquired. £20,000. She demanded £20,000. Inspector Frome's expression reflected the gravity of the situation. Lord Ashford, I must ask directly, did you murder Mrs. Meredith to avoid this extortion? The question hung in the silence that followed, terrible in its directness. Lord Ashford met the inspector's gaze. I did not, Inspector, though I confess that the thought occurred to me, but I am not a man of violence, despite my youth in the colonies. Murder is not a solution that would occur to me as viable, no matter the provocation. Moreover, when I considered the situation with greater rationality, I concluded that Mrs. Meredith's threats were likely without genuine substance. She possessed no concrete evidence that I have discovered. Her leverage consisted primarily of implication and innuendo. I determined that I would resist her demands and call her bluff, and yet someone murdered her, Frome noted. Yes, Lord Ashford agreed quietly. Someone did. That evening Poirot requested that Hastings join him in the library for a private discussion regarding the matter. The faithful captain found his friend seated in his customary armchair, a cup of tisane cooling upon the small table beside him, his expression suggesting intense concentration. I perceive, Hastings, that we are approaching the solution to this puzzle, Poirot began without preamble. The facts have begun to arrange themselves in a pattern that possesses internal logic and coherence. Hastings settled himself in the opposite chair, his expression alert. I confess I find myself completely bewildered. Poirot, he admitted. Nearly every member of this household possessed motive for Mrs. Meredith's death. Any one of them might be guilty. But you perceive the error in that reasoning, my friend. It is precisely because multiple parties possessed strong motive that we must search for the individual whose motive was most compelling, or whose opportunity was most definite. The murderer is not necessarily the one with the strongest motive, but rather the one whose motive, when combined with opportunity and the capacity for violent action, forms the most compelling narrative. Then you believe you have identified the guilty party? Hastings asked. Poirot did not respond immediately. Instead, he rose and made his way to the windows, gazing out into the darkening landscape beyond. "Consider," he said finally, "the character of Mrs. Meredith. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and acute perception. She possessed knowledge that rendered her dangerous to multiple parties, yet she employed that knowledge not with restraint but with systematic pressure, extracting leverage from each person she encountered. This suggests a woman who believed herself to be not merely safe, but secure, who believed that her intelligence and knowledge protected her from consequences. Yet those consequences came," Hastings observed. "Indeed they did, and this suggests to me that Mrs. Meredith was mistaken in her assessment. She perceived someone in this household whom she misjudged, someone whom she believed to be weak, or controllable, or incapable of decisive action, and in this misjudgment lay the seeds of her destruction." Poirot turned from the window to face his friend. "Tell me, Hastings, have you observed a particular pattern in the movements of the household members, in their interactions with one another?" Hastings considered this carefully. "I have observed that Miss Weatherby appears to be systematically kind to everyone, as though deliberately attempting to offset some sense of guilt or liability, and I have noticed that Mr. Thornton has been somewhat withdrawn since Mrs. Meredith's death, less of his characteristic charm and more of a sort of distracted preoccupation," Poirot said with satisfaction. "Your observations are as astute as always. And what of Margaret? What have you observed of the widow Ashford?" "Margaret? She has been visibly distressed, naturally, given that she discovered the body in such horrifying circumstances. But I confess I have also observed in her a kind of relief, as though the shock had somehow released her from a previous state of tension." Poirot nodded slowly. "Your observations are most accurate, Hastings. And now consider this. Eleanor Weatherby was observed by myself in the early morning hours prior to the discovery of the body, ascending the stairs with marked anxiety. Richard Thornton has sustained marks upon his hands that he has attempted to conceal beneath careful bandaging, claiming that they were the result of a minor accident. And Margaret Howard, theatrical and vital Margaret, has been observed in conversation with her husband with considerably more warmth than had previously characterized their interactions." Hastings struggled to follow the implications. "Surely you are not suggesting that all three were involved in the murder, that it was some form of conspiracy?" "Not a conspiracy, precisely," Poirot replied, "but rather a convergence of interests and actions that resulted in a singular outcome. Consider the sequence of events. Richard Thornton, having encountered Mrs. Meredith in the garden and becoming engaged in physical altercation, recognizes her as a dangerous threat to his carefully constructed facade of respectability. Eleanor Weatherby, having observed Mrs. Meredith's manipulations and perceiving the damage she intends to cause to the household, also recognizes her as destructive. Margaret Ashford, having learned of Mrs. Meredith's knowledge of her husband's vulnerabilities and her intentions to employ that knowledge for financial gain, similarly recognizes her as a threat to her own security." "But surely they would not have coordinated to murder her," Hastings protested. "Not deliberately, perhaps, but under certain circumstances, individuals may find themselves moving in concert toward a common objective without formal conspiracy or agreement, each acting from their own motivations, each believing themselves to be acting alone. They may collectively accomplish what none would have accomplished individually." Hastings remained silent, awaiting further elaboration. "There is, however," Poirot continued, a particular element of this case that has troubled me considerably. The body was moved to the pool and concealed beneath the weighted purse. Actions that suggest deliberate concealment rather than mere panic disposal. Such actions require both planning and determination. They suggest not a crime of passion, but rather a calculated elimination of a threat. He returned to his chair and settled himself with evident satisfaction. I believe, Hastings, that tomorrow the light will begin to clear regarding these matters. Inspector Frome will, I suspect, arrive with certain information regarding Mrs. Meredith's background and previous activities. When combined with what we have already determined, that information may provide the final piece of the puzzle. The following morning, Inspector Frome arrived at Ravensholm Manor, carrying a leather folder of considerable thickness. He sought out Poirot immediately, requesting a private meeting before conducting any further official interrogations. The inspector's expression suggested that he had discovered matters of substantial significance. I have been pursuing certain lines of inquiry, he explained, as he settled himself in the study with Poirot, following suggestions that emerged from our previous discussions. In particular, I investigated Mrs. Meredith's background and activities prior to her attendance at this weekend gathering. He opened the folder and extracted several documents. What I have discovered is both complex and informative. Mrs. Meredith was not, as she represented herself, a woman of independent means. She was, in fact, engaged in a systematic program of blackmail and extortion against multiple parties. We have discovered evidence suggesting that over the past decade, she extracted approximately £120,000 from various victims, through threats of exposure regarding past indiscretions. A substantial sum, Poirot observed, yet she continued to engage in this practice. Indeed, more troubling still, we have determined that certain of her victims experienced particularly acute distress. One man, a former diplomat, appears to have emigrated to Australia specifically to escape her machinations. Another businessman suffered a complete nervous collapse. Mrs. Meredith, it would appear, was not merely engaged in financial extraction but was deliberately employing extortion as a form of psychological control. A woman of considerable cruelty, then, Poirot said softly. Indeed. Moreover, we have discovered communications suggesting that her appearance at Ravensholm Manor was part of a larger pattern of coordinated extortion. She had identified this household as a particularly vulnerable target, and had arranged her presence here specifically to advance her schemes against Lord Ashford and, subsequently, against other members of the household. Inspector Frome withdrew another document, but what is most revealing is this. We have discovered evidence linking Mrs. Meredith to a particularly infamous previous case involving the death of a woman named Margaret Thornton, some 18 years ago. Richard Thornton's former wife, I believe. The room seemed to contract around these words. Go on, Poirot said quietly. The death was officially ruled a suicide. She threw herself from a cliff in Cornwall. However, there have always been questions regarding the circumstances. The inquiry was conducted with remarkable speed, and certain evidence was apparently not pursued with thoroughness. Mrs. Meredith, I have discovered, was in residence in Cornwall at the time, and was known to have interactions with the deceased woman's family. You believe Mrs. Meredith was implicated in that death? Poirot asked. I believe, Monsieur Poirot, that Mrs. Meredith may have been engaged in extortion against the Thornton family, and that the extortion may have resulted in circumstances that led to Margaret Thornton's death. Richard Thornton lost his wife under tragic circumstances and was left with a child to raise alone. He has since conducted himself with apparent propriety, but the trauma of that period has clearly left its mark. Poirot rose and made his way to the window, his expression suggesting profound concentration. And when Mr. Thornton discovered that the woman who had arguably been responsible for his wife's death, Thor at minimum, had contributed significantly to the circumstances that resulted in that death was present at this house party. His reaction must have been one of considerable intensity. Precisely so, Inspector Frome agreed. When confronted with this evidence, Mr. Thornton admitted to knowing who Mrs. Meredith was. He stated that he had been deeply distressed upon learning of her presence at the gathering, and that he had indeed encountered her in the garden with the intention of confronting her regarding her past actions. Yet he did not murder her in that encounter, Poirot observed. No. He claims that their encounter was heated, but that it concluded without fatal consequences. However, he admits that he was awake during the pre-dawn hours, and that he did venture outside the house during the time when Mrs. Meredith was murdered. Did he approach the pool? Poirot asked. He states that he did not. That he remained in the gardens, contemplating the matter and attempting to regain his emotional equilibrium. Poirot turned from the window to face the inspector. Tell me, Inspector, have you interrogated Miss Weatherby regarding her movements during the critical time period? Inspector Frome consulted his notes. I have. Miss Weatherby admits to being awake and to having ventured downstairs during the pre-dawn hours. She claims that she was concerned regarding matters of household management and went to consult certain documents in Lord Ashford's study. She did not approach the pool. And yet she was observed in anxiety and with dust upon her person, Poirot noted. The dust suggests some encounter with the ground, or with something that would have rendered her clothing soiled. Did you inquire into the source of that dust? I did. She stated that in the darkness she had stumbled near one of the garden paths and had fallen. She claimed that she had not mentioned the fall because she feared Lord Ashford's disapproval should he learn that she had ventured into the gardens during unsuitable hours and had been clumsy enough to fall. Poirot nodded slowly, as though considering this explanation. And finally, Inspector, what of Margaret Ashford? What has your investigation revealed regarding her movements during the critical hours? Mrs. Ashford has admitted to being awake and has stated that she remained in her bedroom during the relevant time period. However, she did acknowledge experiencing considerable emotional distress regarding certain personal matters, and her account of her specific movements during those hours is somewhat vague. And has there been any investigation into the physical evidence that might suggest her presence at the pool? Poirot inquired. There is one anomaly, Inspector Frome said slowly. We have discovered traces of chlorine upon a shawl found in Mrs. Ashford's room. The presence of chlorine would be consistent with exposure to the pool water. However, Mrs. Ashford has offered a plausible explanation. She stated that she had worn the shawl on the previous afternoon when observing the swimming activities, and that the chlorine from the pool had contaminated the garment at that time. Poirot returned to his chair and seated himself with evident satisfaction. I believe, Inspector, that the time has come for me to present my analysis of this matter to the assembled household. If you would be willing to summon them to the drawing room, I believe I can illuminate the circumstances with considerable precision. Within the hour, the drawing room of Ravensholm Manor had been arranged with that peculiar formality that such scenes invariably assumed. The 12 members of the household were seated in various arrangements, some in chairs, some upon sofas, all positioned such that they could observe one another and, more importantly, observe the central space where Poirot had positioned himself. Inspector Frome stood near the doorway, his constables positioned at either end of the room. The atmosphere was one of barely suppressed tension. Everyone present understood that the purpose of this gathering was to determine guilt and innocence, and that the outcome would inevitably alter the lives of those present in profound and permanent ways. Poirot regarded the assembled company with his habitual calm, allowing the silence to extend until it became almost unbearable. Then, with measured deliberation, he began to speak. The death of Mrs. Constance Meredith, he said, his accent lending his words a precise formality, was the result not of a simple crime of passion, nor of a spontaneous act of violence. Rather, It was the culmination of a pattern of predatory behavior that extended across decades and encompassed the destruction of multiple lives. To understand who murdered Mrs. Meredith, one must first understand the woman herself, not as she presented herself to society, but as she actually was. He paused, allowing his eyes to sweep across the assembled faces. Mrs. Meredith was an expert in the science of leverage. She possessed an acute understanding of human weakness and an absolute willingness to exploit that weakness for financial gain. Over a period of approximately 10 years, she extracted sums totaling in excess of £100,000 from various victims through systematic extortion and blackmail. Her methods were sophisticated, her targets were carefully selected, and her victims were chosen specifically because they possessed sufficient resources to pay her demands, yet insufficient social standing or emotional resilience to withstand the threat of exposure. He addressed the household directly. In this room are multiple individuals who possessed both knowledge of this predatory behavior and significant motivation to eliminate the threat that Mrs. Meredith represented. That is to say, multiple members of this household had reason to wish Mrs. Meredith dead. However, Poirot continued, motive alone does not constitute evidence of guilt. To determine guilt, one must examine opportunity, method, and psychology. One must establish not merely who could have committed this crime, but who actually did commit it. He turned his attention to Richard Thornton. Mr. Thornton possessed perhaps the most powerful of all conceivable motives. The woman who was murdered was indirectly responsible for the death of his former wife. Death that official inquiry determined to be suicide, but which appears to have occurred under circumstances that Mrs. Meredith deliberately orchestrated through systematic extortion and psychological abuse. For Mr. Thornton, encountering Mrs. Meredith at this gathering must have represented a convergence of trauma and opportunity. Richard Thornton's face had gone ashen. He attempted to speak, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. However, Mr. Thornton did not murder Mrs. Meredith. This I can establish with considerable certainty, based upon the evidence available. When Mr. Thornton encountered Mrs. Meredith in the garden, the two engaged in physical altercation. The scratches upon Mrs. Meredith's face were the result of that encounter. However, this encounter occurred in daylight, with other members of the household potentially in close proximity. Moreover, Mr. Thornton's psychological pattern as manifested by his actions and demeanor both before and after the murder does not suggest a man who has committed an act of premeditated violence. He turned next to Eleanor. Weatherby, Miss Weatherby, you are employed by Lord Ashford and have been privy to the deliberations of this household for some 18 months. Through your position, you have become aware of Mrs. Meredith's predatory activities and her specific intentions toward Lord Ashford. You have also, I believe, come to regard Lord Ashford and his family with a sense of protective loyalty that transcends the normal employer-employee relationship. Eleanor did not respond, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. You were awake during the pre-dawn hours, Poirot continued. You descended to Lord Ashford's study to consult certain documents, Astamley household-related documents, but in fact documents that would have allowed you to understand the full scope of Mrs. Meredith's extortion demands. You ventured into the gardens, and the dust upon your sleeve resulted from an encounter near the pool area. Yet you did not murder Mrs. Meredith. I perceive this clearly from your psychological profile and from the nature of the physical evidence. You contemplated the act, I believe. You may even have positioned yourself to enable it, but the actual execution of violence was not within your capacity. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent. Finally, Poirot's attention settled upon Margaret Ashford. And now we arrive at the nexus of this matter. Madame, you are a woman of considerable intelligence and acute emotional sensitivity. You are married to Adrian Ashford, a man whose emotional limitations have rendered your marriage a source of profound frustration. You have attempted to enliven that marriage through provocative behavior and theatrical displays. Yet these efforts have been consistently met with your husband's emotional detachment. Margaret's mouth opened as if to respond, but Poirot continued with uninterrupted precision. You became aware, through various channels, of Mrs. Meredith's presence at this gathering, and of her intentions toward Lord Ashford. More significantly, you became aware of her knowledge regarding Adrian's financial precariousness and her intention to employ that knowledge and the threat of exposure regarding Lord Ashford's past indiscretions as leverage for financial gain. You understood, madame, that if Mrs. Meredith's extortion succeeded, the financial consequences to the Ashford family would be severe. This realization, combined with your perception of Mrs. Meredith as a threat to your marriage and your social position, generated within you a profound desire to eliminate that threat. Margaret rose from her seat with a gesture of violent denial. "This is absurd," she exclaimed. "You have no proof of any such thing." "On the contrary," Madame Poirot replied with undisturbed calm, "the evidence is quite substantial. The chlorine upon your shawl cannot be dismissed as the result of incidental exposure. The concentration is far too great, and the pattern of contamination suggests immersion in chlorinated water rather than mere contact. Furthermore, you made the critical error of attempting to conceal this evidence through careful placement of the shawl in your room. An innocent party would have either disposed of the shawl entirely or left it in a location where its discovery would seem natural and unsuspicious." He turned to Inspector Frome. "Inspector, I believe you have tested the hypothesis I suggested regarding the creation of the weighted purse, that it was assembled using materials readily available within the household." Inspector Frome nodded and stepped forward. "We have, Monsieur Poirot. The cord and the weight derived from materials stored in the household's garden shed. The purse itself is a common leather item with no identifying markers. The money Mrs. Meredith's own funds, as it transpires, was taken from her room." Poirot turned back to Margaret. "You encountered Mrs. Meredith during the pre-dawn hours, madame. Perhaps you approached her under the pretext of discussion or negotiation. Perhaps you intended merely to reason with her, to persuade her to abandon her scheme of extortion. But in the darkness and privacy of those pre-dawn hours, some element of the encounter escalated beyond the bounds of negotiation." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. "The paperweight from Lord Ashford's study was employed to strike Mrs. Meredith from behind, resulting in her immediate death. Whether this was deliberate murder, or whether the death resulted from an act that escalated beyond your conscious intention, the law recognizes little distinction. The body was then transported to the pool in action, requiring both physical strength and psychological determination. The body was weighted and concealed beneath the surface. Moreover, madame, you subsequently instructed the household in a manner designed to ensure that an investigation would eventually occur in your presence. You positioned yourself at the pool during the morning swimming activities. You positioned yourself such that you would be present when the body was discovered, thus ensuring that you would not appear to have guilty knowledge of its location." Margaret had sunk back into her chair, her face a mask of shock and denial. "It is impossible," she whispered. "I was in my room. I never left my room." "Your initial statement claimed this," Poirot agreed. "However, the physical evidence contradicts this claim. The chlorine concentration upon your shawl, the dust pattern upon your clothing during the pre-dawn hours, all of these elements suggest your presence at the pool and in circumstances involving violent action." He turned to address the assembled household. "There remains, however, a factor that must be acknowledged. While Mrs. Meredith's death may have been technically the result of Margaret Ashford's actions, the circumstances that created that moment of violence were the direct result of Mrs. Meredith's own predatory behavior. Mrs. Meredith was a woman who had deliberately chosen to exploit human weakness and suffering as a method of achieving financial gain. She had destroyed multiple lives through her systematic extortion. She had participated in circumstances that directly contributed to the death of Richard Thornton's former wife. She had arrived at Ravensholm Manor with the deliberate intention of extracting vast sums of money through threats and psychological manipulation. The law, Poirot continued, makes no distinction between the murder of a virtuous individual and the murder of a predatory one. Justice, however, sometimes possesses a dimension that exceeds the mere application of legal principle. He turned to Inspector Frome. Inspector, the evidence is clear, and I believe you have sufficient basis for formal charges. However, I would suggest that in your subsequent investigation and interrogation of Margaret Ashford, you allow for the emergence of a narrative that acknowledges both her guilt and the provocation that generated it. The courts and the legal system will, ultimately, determine appropriate consequences, but the truth is best served when presented in its full complexity. Inspector Frome approached Margaret Ashford with evident reluctance and proceeded to inform her of her rights and of the charges that were being leveled against her. Margaret listened with an expression of numb disbelief, and when offered the opportunity to make a statement, she did so with a voice scarcely above a whisper. She was going to destroy everything, Margaret said. Everything that Adrian's family has built, everything that Adrian himself represents. I could not permit that destruction. When I encountered her in the darkness, when I recognized the absolute certainty that she intended to proceed with her extortion, something within me simply closed off. I acted without conscious deliberation. I do not even remember striking her, though I do remember carrying the body to the pool. I remember being surprised at my own strength, my own capacity for action in circumstances that should have paralyzed me with fear. She looked toward her husband, who sat frozen in his chair, his face an impenetrable mask. I did what I believed necessary to protect my family, Margaret continued. I do not ask for forgiveness or for mitigation. I am aware of what I have done. I am merely acknowledging that the circumstances left me without choice, or at least without the capacity to perceive any alternative. The events that followed Mrs. Meredith's death extended across weeks rather than days. Margaret Ashford was formally charged with murder and, after a trial that consumed considerable media attention, was convicted on the basis of the overwhelming physical evidence and her own eventual confession. She was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment, a sentence that provoked considerable debate in the popular press regarding the propriety of the judgment. Given the circumstances of provocation and the nature of the victim's predatory behavior, Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings remained at Ravensholm Manor for several days following the arrest, assisting Inspector Frome in the documentation and processing of evidence. The household, in the aftermath of the revelations, had transformed from an assemblage of superficially civilized individuals into a collection of broken and introspective souls. Lord Ashford, upon being fully informed of the extent of Mrs. Meredith's extortion schemes, experienced a comprehensive reassessment of his obligations and his moral position. He subsequently undertook to compensate certain of Mrs. Meredith's previous victims, a gesture that proved both financially significant and emotionally restorative to those parties who had suffered beneath her predatory schemes. Richard Thornton, having learned that his former wife's death was likely the result of Mrs. Meredith's deliberate manipulation, found a form of peace that had eluded him for nearly 2 decades. The knowledge that justice, however finally been served, allowed him to begin the process of genuine emotional recovery. He subsequently undertook charitable work on behalf of families affected by suicide and psychological abuse. Adrian Ashford, confronted with the reality of his wife's capacity for violence and the circumstances that had generated that capacity, underwent his own profound psychological reassessment. His relationship with his father was recalibrated, and he began the slow process of developing emotional resilience and genuine understanding of both his limitations and his responsibilities. Eleanor Weatherby, having confronted her own complicity in the circumstances that had led to Mrs. Meredith's death, ultimately decided to seek employment elsewhere. Her sense of loyalty to the Ashford family had been complicated by the knowledge that her own actions, however well-intentioned, had contributed to a sequence of events culminating in murder. It was on their final evening at Ravensholm Manor that Poirot and Hastings sat once more beside the pool. The same pool that had served as both the instrument and the concealment of Mrs. Meredith's death. "I find myself reflecting upon the nature of causation," Poirot observed, his eyes fixed upon the glittering surface of the water. "We say that Margaret Ashford murdered Mrs. Meredith. Yet in what sense was that murder distinct from the murder that Mrs. Meredith had committed against Margaret's emotional state? Her sense of security, her psychological equilibrium, were not. All of these prior acts also forms of violence, merely operating beneath the surface of civilized interaction." Hastings considered this philosophical meditation for a moment, before responding, "I suppose, Poirot, that one might argue that Mrs. Meredith's predatory behavior created the circumstances that made murder possible. Yet, I confess, I find that a troubling line of reasoning. It seems to suggest that murder is merely a natural consequence of psychological abuse, a suggestion that, if pursued to its logical conclusion, would render nearly every human conflict a potential justification for violence." "You are entirely correct," my friend Poirot replied, "and yet the truth is complex. Mrs. Meredith was, without question, a destructive force, a woman who had deliberately chosen to exploit human weakness and suffering. Yet the law makes no distinction based upon the virtue or vice of the victim. Justice is blind precisely because it must be blind. Otherwise it becomes merely the imposition of one person's moral judgment upon another. And yet," Hastings suggested, "I perceive in your manner some sense of sympathy for Margaret Ashford's position." Poirot turned to regard his friend with those piercing eyes. "Sympathy and condemnation are not mutually exclusive, Hastings. One may comprehend the circumstances that generate an act of violence without endorsing the violence itself. One may perceive in Margaret Ashford a woman who, under different circumstances in which she had possessed greater emotional resilience, greater capacity for alternative solutions, a husband more emotionally responsive to her needs, might never have been capable of such an act. Yet the circumstances did occur precisely as they did, and the act was committed precisely as it was committed. That is the nature of human existence. We are the product of our circumstances, yet we are also responsible for our choices." They sat in silence for a time, watching the light fade from the sky and the pool transform from brilliant azure to deepening shadow. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said finally, rising from his chair. "We have remained long enough in this place. Our work here is concluded, and my little gray cells require rest and restoration. I perceive that there is a restaurant of considerable reputation some 30 miles hence, where I am informed the cuisine possesses a level of excellence comparable to the continental standard. I believe we should endeavor to achieve that destination before evening progresses further." Hastings rose and extended his arm to assist his aging friend. "I must confess, Poirot, that I find myself perpetually amazed by your capacity to contemplate the darkest aspects of human nature and yet remain interested in the cultivation of culinary excellence. How do you reconcile these apparently contradictory inclinations?" "It is simple, Hastings," Poirot replied with a slight smile. "Order, precision, and the cultivation of excellence in small things. These are precisely what distinguish civilization from chaos. Mrs. Meredith represented disorder and predatory exploitation. A well-prepared meal represents discipline, expertise, and the assertion of human will against entropy. To enjoy cuisine is not frivolous, is an act of civilization itself." As they made their way through the corridors of Ravensholm Manor for the final time, passing through the great hall and toward the entrance where their automobile awaited, Poirot paused briefly to regard his reflection in the mirror that hung in the entry vestibule. "The little mustache," he murmured to himself with evident satisfaction, adjusting the facial hair with characteristic precision. maintains its orderly configuration, despite all the disorder that surrounds us. This is as it should be. In a world of chaos, one maintains what one can control. Hastings, observing this peculiar ritual, could not suppress a smile. Truly, he reflected, Hercule Poirot was a singular individual, a man who had devoted his extraordinary intellect to the pursuit of truth and justice, yet who never allowed such grave pursuits to compromise his attention to the small details that rendered life civilized and orderly. As the automobile departed Raven's Manor and made its way into the gathering twilight, Poirot settled back into the seat with evident satisfaction. "The little gray cells are tired, Hastings," he remarked, "but they are also gratified. Another puzzle has been resolved. Another instance of human weakness and predatory behavior has been confronted by the exercise of reason and systematic deduction. All is well." "Not entirely well, I fear," Hastings suggested gently. "A woman is condemned to imprisonment. A family is fractured. Lives have been irrevocably altered." "All true," Poirot acknowledged. "Yet, consider what would have occurred had Mrs. Meredith not been stopped. Multiple families would have been destroyed through psychological manipulation and financial devastation. The predatory cycle would have continued, with Margaret Ashford herself ultimately becoming a victim of Mrs. Meredith's manipulations. In this sense, her act, however violent, however morally ambiguous, has resulted in the cessation of a pattern of systematic harm." "So you believe justice has been served?" Hastings asked. "Justice," Poirot replied thoughtfully, "is a concept of considerably greater complexity than the legal system typically permits. What has occurred at Ravensholm Manor is that a pattern of predatory behavior has been interrupted, that a woman has been held accountable for her actions, that the members of the household have been forced to confront their own complicity in the circumstances that generated tragedy. Whether this constitutes justice in any true sense, well, that is a question best posed to philosophers rather than detectives." The automobile continued through the darkening landscape, carrying its occupants toward rest, restoration, and the contemplation of future challenges. Behind them, Ravensholm Manor receded into distance and shadow, its pools and corridors and drawing rooms returning to their normal routines, even as the knowledge of violence and human capacity for both predation and protection remained permanently imprinted upon the consciousness of those who had dwelt within its walls. And Hercule Poirot, having completed his investigation with his characteristic precision and thoroughness, allowed himself to contemplate the evening's dinner with the satisfaction of one who had restored order to chaos and had illuminated truth in circumstances of deliberate obfuscation. The world, he reflected, was fundamentally disordered and chaotic, yet through the application of reason, method, and the disciplined exercise of intellectual capability, one might impose pattern and understanding upon that chaos. This was not, perhaps, a complete or permanent solution to the human condition, but it was, at least, something. And something Hercule Poirot believed was infinitely preferable to nothing at all.